Hi everyone and welcome to Real World Data Science. Today I'm joined by Professor Sylvie Delacroix, lead author of the position paper Beyond Quantification, Navigating Uncertainty in Professional AI Systems, which is the first publication in the Royal Statistical Society's new journal, RSS Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. Sylvie is the inaugural Jeff Price Chair in Digital Law at King's College London, a director of the Centre for Data Futures, and a leading thinker on the intersection of technology, ethics, and professional practice. Her work focuses on how we design systems that respect human judgment and values, and she's been a strong advocate for participatory approaches to AI, ensuring that professionals have a voice in shaping how uncertainty is expressed. So today we're going to explore the ideas behind this paper, why uncertainty matters for AI in high-stakes domains, and what needs to happen now to make participatory design a reality. Sylvie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Annie.
So I wanted to start by asking, just for your perspective as lead author of the paper, on what conversations you're hoping to spark around it and sort of why now.
Well, I mean, the key thing is that I've been looking at the literature on basically getting large language models to communicate their outputs with some measure of reliability, right? And there's few people who will disagree with the idea that indeed it is very important for those systems to become more reliable, in the sense that at the moment, many of us don't really know whether we can, in fact, take the output of a large language model at face value, right? It's very hard to gauge the reliability of these outputs. So there's huge amounts of efforts and investment currently being put into getting these large language models to communicate the output with some measure of reliability, as I was just saying. The problem is they only focus on quantifiable forms of uncertainty. And what do I mean by this? I mean that basically you could, for instance, give, let's say, a confidence score that, let's say it's an LLM that's trying to assist a GP, and the GP is trying to consider various diagnostic tools for a given condition. Now, you could say, well, you could color code the diagnostic tools with, in red, the most salient ones, and in yellow, the least salient ones. And you could say, we have a very high confidence that this diagnostic tool is in fact the correct one for this presentation, and then low confidence that this diagnostic tool is correct one. Now you could quantify that, right? And that's indeed useful. The problem is that the professional, like a GP, when they face patients, yes, they do sometimes need quantifiable measures of uncertainty to navigate and make choices. But sometimes equally, they face non-quantifiable types of uncertainty. What I mean by this is well captured by an example we use in the paper, actually, where we say, well, imagine that you have a patient who comes in with a bruise on her arm. Now, she's been, she has a pattern of repeated visits. It's very unclear what her symptoms might be caused by. And so you could imagine a system that gives you a probability score that there is a link between the bruise and the situation of domestic abuse at home. It's imagination at the moment, because at the moment, I don't think we have the kind of data that would make that a reality, but let's imagine, right? And you could even have a system that says, oh, and let's say there's a 65% chance that there's a link between the bruise and the domestic abuse. And I am 55% confident that there's a 65% chance of the link. Well, this is great in theory. The risk is that if we design these systems in a way that means they're only capable of communicating these quantifiable types of uncertainty, we risk systematically undermining the significance and importance of non-quantifiable types of uncertainty, which in this case are exemplified by a question that the GP faces, which is no less important, which is, okay, maybe then there is, let's say, a 65% chance of domestic abuse. Do I document this possibility in my notes? Now that's a momentous decision, actually, because it could have a very significant consequences down the line for the family, the patient, etc. And so how do you gauge whether to document or not? You're faced with uncertainty, but that uncertainty, it cannot be captured in a percentage. You cannot help steer the judgment of the GP by giving the GP some kind of measurable score of uncertainty. And so this is what I mean by non-quantifiable type of uncertainty. It's a type of uncertainty that's actually fundamentally ethical and contextual. Yeah, so it's not clear what to do because moral values are at stake, which may be ill-defined. And there's also context-dependent factors. Sometimes you just don't know whether this will lead to protecting the patient or perhaps aggravating the situation, escalating the situation, etc. And so that's those forms of uncertainty, they are no less important than the quantifiable ones. And the danger I see right now is that there's so much effort being put into getting these systems to communicate the output with some measure of reliability that we are at risk of completely forgetting about the fact that in many domains, especially the professional domains like healthcare, justice, education, actually those non-quantifiable forms of uncertainty are at least as important, right? And so if we end up with systems that are only equipped for the latter kind, the quantifiable types, then actually you could end up really changing the nature of professional practices. Because you can imagine a scenario where GPs lose the height, they lose the capacity to pay attention to those non-quantifiable forms of uncertainty because they're never expressed, right? So that to me is a major, it's a systemic risk, but it's also a major opportunity. And that's the beauty of this, right? Is that I think we are, call me an optimist, I'm happy to be called an optimist, but I think we're still at a moment in time where those systems are still plastic enough that an intervention is possible. And the intervention that we want is ideally one that means the systems are moldable by the users over time. And that's what we mean by participatory interfaces, but I've talked too much already.
No, not at all, not at all. And we'll move on to sort of the nuts and bolts of the participatory refinement part in a minute, I suppose. But I guess the next thing I wanted to ask is how you explain those ideas to professionals, because I know that's a big part of your work, is that kind of interdisciplinary communication. So I suppose professionals who are used to thinking in terms of probabilities and confidence intervals, how do you go about talking them through this slightly new way of thinking about things?
Well, the first obstacle that I face very often is people will tell me, Sylvie, why do you say non-quantifiable? You know, a lot of people will say, basically what you mean is non-quantified forms of uncertainty, right? So the first hurdle that you have to kind of jump over is to convince my interlocutors that no, in fact, there are genuinely some forms of uncertainty that are not quantifiable. And that requires an argument about basically, let's say, moral values. Why are moral values not subsumable under some kind of equation, some kind of measurable understanding of uncertainty? And that's something that I try to outline at greater length in other papers. But so that's the first hurdle, is to really explain why I think it's very problematic to assume that you can reduce ethical uncertainty to basically a matter of moral sums. Yeah, so once you've passed this hurdle, then the second stage is to then engage with the reality of professional practice from a first-person perspective. And that's where I find the work of GPs fascinating, because in their own words, they describe their job, their experience, as effectively the art of navigating uncertainty in a very time-restricted fashion. They have 10, maybe 15 minutes, far fewer resources than, say, specialists have at their disposal. And so they also tell me, we just don't know what's going to walk through the door. Every 15 minutes, anything could walk through the door. And so you have to be prepared, the kind of engagement that as a professional you bring to each situation is a very special kind of engagement where you try and build a rapport with the patient. You also have to pay attention to who else is in the room. Is there a child? Is there potentially something you need to worry about on this front, etc., etc. And so that's what I find fascinating is this includes a much wider form of human intelligence than that which you can narrow down to, oh, we have to deliberate about a particular cognitive problem, and these are the cognitive skills we bring to it. GPs are actually very keen to basically assert the importance of those non-cognitive aspects of their professional expertise, right? So that's why I do work with GPs. I think this is true with many other professions, right? Now, in education, I think it's one of those also very pressing areas where right now, like the Department of Education, for instance, is funding work to develop large language model-based tools as augmentation for marking exams, national exams. Right? Now, at the moment, they're focusing on science topics, but imagine when they move to topics like history, literature, whatever. It's a disaster in the making if we don't think very seriously about those non-quantifiable forms of uncertainty. Like, for instance, imagine a book about arranged marriage. You could quantify the syntactic accuracy of the summary, and you can say, this mark is it's like 80% likely to be like the mark of 10 human teachers. That's a quantifiable form of uncertainty again. But what you can't quantify is oh, the student has taken arranged marriage completely at face value, never ask any question. Should that be flagged? How should that be translated into feedback for the student or for the teacher? That's a very morally loaded question, again, where there's uncertainty, but you can't quantify it. Yeah. So that's what I see as completely fascinating, and where I think to do good work, to really leverage what are pre-existing participatory affordances in these tools, you have to be prepared to really think about how human intelligence in this context flourishes. And very often it really depends on the possibility of collective, patient kind of listening and unpacking of what are not always cognitively articulated views, right? Sometimes there are more interrogations, there are perhaps tentative views. And in this case, healthcare is probably quite advanced, actually, in precisely they've developed these interdisciplinary fora to make it possible for different specialists to air their uncertainties or to air their tentative views in a way that allows for learning, right? So that's what I find fascinating, is that these tools right now, if we are going to make them as good tools as they can possibly be to support human intelligence in all its facets, this is forcing us to think much harder and much more practically about how human intelligence flourishes. And for instance, when does it demand collective types of deliberation, and what type of skills are involved? Are they only cognitive, or are they also intuitive, etc., etc.? So that's the kind of thing that I find really fascinating, basically.
Yeah, me too. So fascinating. So earlier you described yourself as an optimist, and I'm just wondering whether you feel optimistic about the use of these tools in all the different contexts. So, for example, the example you just raised of LLMs being used to augment exam marking. Do you think that is something that you feel optimistic about us potentially getting right? Or do you think there's a world where that could be successful in the ways that we want it to be? Or do you think there are some areas where we just shouldn't take LLMs at all?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think LLMs should be deployed everywhere in every context, that's for sure. And really what's interesting right now is that we are faced with a situation where often these tools are already being deployed de facto. Like with GPs, there was a paper published 2 weeks ago that said 25% of GPs across the country now use LLMs for one purpose or another. And by LLMs, it can be anything. This is a wide range. There is no uniquely like validated system. And so what I find fascinating is there's a double question here. There's, on one hand, there's a question about what's happening in practice. And often practice has run away with us. Like in GP practice, I find it's both scary and intimidating to think that 25% of GPs are using LLMs daily in their practice when the systems are not necessarily designed for that purpose. There is no guidelines, etc., etc. So that's one where we face with a situation, and the question is, given that they are being used, can we design them in a way that makes them beneficial, right? That's one question. You could, of course, say, well, let's ban them. And this is a reaction I often have with this particular example I'm going to give you. I was actually given a real example of GPs using large language models as a tool for sense making, where basically, let's say a GP has had a difficult conversation with a patient earlier that day, and they feel that maybe they overlooked something, or that they didn't, they were not as sensitive as they should have been to the situation of the patient, for instance. And they, instead of bothering a colleague, they're all very busy, etc., and they don't want to bother their partner at home either. On their way home, they chat with this large language model to unpack what happened and why they feel a sense of unease. This is a real case, right? Now, this is what I call an example of sense-making conversation, right? Where you try and tease out intuitions through conversation with, in this case, a large language model. Now, a reaction I get quite often is, well, you should not use a large language model for this, because this is a very clear example. These conversations are not neutral. They are actually engines for moral change. This is often in those informal one-to-one conversations that we first perhaps emerging moral intuition, so a sense of unease, like let's say, when sexual harassment wasn't a concept yet. You can nevertheless experience unease, and you don't know why. You cannot really articulate why you are uncomfortable. And we make progress. I mean, progress, I hope we make progress, but at least we evolve as a society in our moral views, largely at the beginning through these conversations. So if large language models are being used as these conversational partners, I mean, this has momentous implications, because then they're becoming a significant part of the mechanism through which, as a society, we evolve in our norms and values, right? And so one reaction could be, well, we shouldn't use them like that, right? But the problem is, and there were GPs in the room when I had that answer who said, well, who are you to tell us we shouldn't use LLMs for that purpose? If it helps us, and God knows we all overworked and nobody has time, then who are you to say we shouldn't do that? And so that was a very intriguing conversation, I thought. And so I don't know if this answers your question, but so to me, there's certainly, there's two questions really. There are questions about how to revalue human-to-human conversations, and how to make sure we make space for them and we value them as much as they should be. That is, for me, primary, right? And so, for instance, in the case of GPs, there is very much a focus on saying, okay, can large language models be used in a way that means actually GPs have more time for interacting with the patient, right? That would be nice. But then there's the other question, which is, but given that they are being used anyway for all sorts of things, including highly sensitive things like these sense-making conversations, well, rather than put our heads in the sand, maybe we need to think hard about how they should be designed, given that they are being used like this, right? So,
yeah, no, that's a really interesting answer. Thank you. So then we've kind of covered some of the next things I was going to ask. So maybe we could talk about the participatory refinement process a little bit. I know you've worked with general practitioners a lot on the kind of realities of what this looks like in practice. So I wondered if you could just talk us through that a bit and maybe share some learnings from your experiences in that area.
I mean, this is very much a work in progress. It's moving slowly but surely. At this stage, what we're doing, there's two different things. One is, there's this group of GPs who are saying, why don't we seek to build a community? So they meet every month anyway. They're like, well, we could imagine a system where there's a discussion board, for instance, an online discussion board, and where we flag, as a group of GPs, let's say it's South London GPs, we flag examples of outputs that are either deemed very helpful or deemed unhelpful when it comes to the navigation of uncertainty. And GPs are busy, so they may not be able to put many comments, but you just flag them on discussion board. You could, for instance, imagine a case where a GP wants to consider which diagnostic tools are most salient for a given presentation. And so you have a color-coded presentation, but it turns out the output does not express the fact that this output might be incomplete. And that, of course, the LLM doesn't have ears, hands, and eyes in the room. And so how do you express incompleteness? That's actually tricky. And how do you express incompleteness in a way that supports the users? And so that could be an interesting example where you could imagine a GP flagging an output and saying, turns out the output could have been very dangerous because it didn't include key diagnostic tools, which were not included because perhaps my input was incomplete, but, still. And so you could imagine then an interesting conversation with the other GPs to figure out together how should incompleteness be expressed? Like, how would they deem it helpful? And that in turn could be part of a gradual process of refinement, focusing on one feature, not on everything, but here the feature that's being refined is how is uncertainty expressed, right? And even you can go even more refined by saying how is non-quantifiable forms of uncertainty expressed, right? And so that's what I've been exploring with these GPs. Now, the other aspect of this, and at the moment we're very early stages, is to say, okay, but to refine large language models, you need data sets, right? And at the moment, if you look at the many data sets out there, there are data sets on uncertainty, but no data set that really tackle what we call doxastic plasticity. Now, what is doxastic plasticity? It's basically how does the expression of uncertainty impact the extent to which we are likely to change our views when it comes to more things, more views. And what I find super interesting is now we are trying to design a classroom experiment where students engage with ethical dilemmas and the LLM takes one side, student the other side, and we ask them to then rate the quality of the conversation and the extent to which uncertainty contributed to that quality and whether they changed their view as a result. And we hope, at the moment this is very uncertain, but we hope to learn from this experiment and to be able to create a small, it's not going to be a huge data set, but a small data set that captures those qualitative expressions of uncertainty that are relevant to doxastic plasticity, so the plasticity of our views. So that's what I just happen to be doing right now with the small means we have at our disposal as they are. I still think that it could also be a very interesting pedagogical experiment because for the students themselves, I think this could contribute to a much fruitful kind of reflection on the kind of features that can really impact the types of answers they get from LLMs and the reflections they can trigger. So that's the beginning of a story. I hope that in the domain of education, actually, there's huge potential in my view, because again, I very much worry that, I think large language models are coming at the moment as augmentation tools for assessment of various exams. It would be a disaster if we design these systems in a way that completely disempowers the teachers. So I very much hope that we can insist in time to design these systems in a way that puts, not just enables, but incentivizes teachers to reflect as a group over the kind of features they want from these systems. And for instance, how uncertainty is expressed is pretty crucial. Right? So that's what I worry about, is because I've always worked on agency, right? This has been the kind of thread running through my research in the last 25 years. And so I'm fascinated by critical agency and what makes it possible. And I think it's very dangerous to take it for granted, to assume that people will exercise the critical agency. They won't necessarily. And it turns out that the way we structure our environment, including the tools we use, like large language models, have a big impact on that. And so I see this moment in time as a particularly momentous occasion from my perspective, because for the first time in my life as mostly a philosopher, I'm also a lawyer, but I'm really a philosopher, there is an opportunity to make very concrete design interventions for those tools in a way that can have a massive impact on the kind of likelihood that we retain this critical agency. So that's the source of my both excitement and sense of it's intimidating as a responsibility, really.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And a couple of times there, you sort of referenced the small resources at your disposal when you're sort of engaging in these participatory refinements or works in progress, as you describe it. And also you mentioned in the case of GPs, they're really busy. Do they have enough time to be inputting comments into the system, all that kind of thing? And that was kind of a question I had, which was around the tension between efficiency-driven goals, which is often what AI and LLMs are brought on to facilitate, and then the obvious sort of time and collaboration that participatory processes require. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on how you balance that tension.
I think that's a great question. And we touch upon it briefly in the paper at the end by saying, there's an obvious worry that this may sound very idealistic, given that, these tools are there to answer a very pressing need often to make this process more efficient. And that's why I think it makes sense to consider these participatory interfaces in the context of the professions, because the professions are still today basically normative practices. They're practices that are structured around norms, but they're not just structured around norms, they also on a daily basis, they re-articulate norms, right? So if doctors or educators or lawyers stop asking themselves what they mean by health or justice or education, then you fall into rote behavior. You fall into kind of patterns of behavior with no attempt to renew your practices and the values that articulate, that structure them. And so, of course, it is the case that many of us don't engage in this kind of reflection on a daily basis. That's fine, as long as there is still an opportunity and a space for this type of normative work to happen. And so what I see today is a situation where, yes, the normative aspects of these practices is far from safe. Let's say it's imperiled on a daily basis under the pressure of all these constraints of being ever more efficient. But at the same time, somehow they are still normative practices, right? And so what I see as an answer to that question is to say, well, surely we are missing a beat if we let the efficiency constraints or the pressure to deliver efficiency come at the cost of, come in a way that means that you actually undermine the very nature of the practices that you're supporting, right? So I think you can deliver efficiency in a way that nevertheless, or in fact, preserves the normative character of those practices, which in the long term might mean that, in fact, this is true efficiency, right? That because once you undermine the normative, the opportunities for normative labor, basically for the, you actually, if you take a long-term view on this, you've actually undermined the system as a whole. So your efficiency gains were very short-term, right? And so that's perhaps my answer to that, is to say that unlike, say, you could take a practice of, I don't know, scuba diving, right? That's not a profession, right? And so let's say there was a constraint to, it's not a great example because the large language models have nothing to do with scuba diving, but I can't think of a good example. There must be some. But where you deploy large language models in a way that delivers efficiency gains in a context that's not normatively structured, sure, right. But in practices that are normatively structured, I think you're basically faced with a situation where either you deploy these systems in a way that undermines systematically the opportunity for normative rearticulation, or you deploy the systems in a way that supports that. And I think it's difficult. I will not be proven right within months or years. This is a kind of long-term argument. But I think ultimately, this is the only way to preserve the very rational and hence existence of those professions. So, yeah.
And this is super interesting. Okay, I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our time, so I wanted to ask you a sort of practical question, because real world data science is kind of all about teasing out the real world applications for our audience. So I wanted to ask your advice on kind of one practical step data scientists or AI developers can take to start integrating those sort of richer uncertainty communications into their systems.
Okay, practical step. Well, I mean, there's, of course, at the very basic level, you can, through prompting strategies, you can encourage a system to, for instance, express ethical uncertainty and to express different points of view, etc. That can be done right now. There's, of course, worries about the fact that we don't always know for sure whether a prompting strategy delivers consistent results. So some people will say that might work on an individual basis. But when you are faced with a system like the NHS, where you really want a community of practice to kind of develop a way of interacting with the system, then the prompting strategy seems a bit brittle because you risk not having consistent results. And that's why the case for participatory interfaces is there, right? Now, at the moment, these participatory interfaces, they've not yet been tested. This is what I hope to do in the next 2-3 years, right? If I get the funding, this is what I will devote my life to, is to basically try and pilot these participatory interfaces. So I'm very committed to going from theory to practice here. I don't think it's good enough to just say these are desirable. Yeah, we have to demonstrate they're feasible. So at the moment, I don't have the kind of grants, the fundings that mean I can develop these as pilots. So I'm focusing on creating data sets because that's what I can do with my limited funding, right? But so I don't know if that answers your question, but so in my view, the prompting strategies are always a good start when we don't have the kind of more sophisticated interface that I wish for. But you have to ask yourself, does it make sense for me as an individual to refine how ethical uncertainty is expressed, or do we need to consider this on a collective basis? And I think often the answer is yes, we need to consider this on a collective basis. And the problem is that the participatory affordances as they exist are still very much geared towards individuals, right? So I hope we can change this. I see no reason why we can't. It's just that it's not necessarily aligned with commercial incentives as they exist today. And that's why I think it's our job as academics to show why these are not just desirable, but important and feasible, right? To deploy before these systems are very frozen when it comes to design choices. Yeah.
And then I suppose if there was one piece of advice you had for practitioners deploying AI in high stakes settings, is there anything else? What's sort of the one thing you want people to know or do?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. I mean, of course, coming from where I come from, I would encourage them to not be too fascinated by the so-called artificial intelligence of the tools they're using. There's a trend to draw attention far too much to how is this system intelligent? What are the kind of benchmarks that it achieves, etc. And instead shift focus to human intelligence and how it's affected by their use of this system, right? So I would really encourage them to think, okay, if I'm using the system, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? We know we have limited time. We know as humans we can only collect very limited amounts of data and process even less data. And so, yes, AI systems can be amazing tools precisely because they can ingurgitate way more data than we can humans and process it even better. But it's a big but. What am I trying to achieve? So how can I truly enhance the types of skills and the types of attitudes that I want to bring to a particular situation, right? And I think that ought to be the first question that we ask. Start from the human and what the human wants supported in addressing a given problem. And that then means that the question is then, okay, what features do I want from this system, right? What does the system need to do in order to really fulfill my needs as a human? I think that's where we want to start, basically.
Yeah, I love that way of looking at it, and that's quite a unusual take. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, is there anything else you would like to say or want people to know about the paper or your work in general?
I mean, I think about the paper, the key thing is that it's a call for arms, which is to say, like, we have this window of opportunity right now. And certainly I am not enough to bring about the kind of change that is needed. So we need concerted efforts from people, whether they are professionals, to really demand these participatory interface features, whether they're regulators to insist that perhaps there is an alternative to commercial incentives as they exist, or whether we are designers of these tools, where perhaps we need to wake up to the fact that there are some questions that are genuinely better answered by the users. And that it's okay to empower users to answer some of the value-loaded questions that until recently could only be tackled at the design stage, and which I think today that assumption can be challenged, right? That we can, for certain features, move to a user-centric model. And to me, that's huge. And I don't think we've really gotten our heads around the significance of that yet. And also its implications for democratic practices, actually. So it's big, and I would say that we can't afford to be passive right now. And that there is a tendency, and I'm very worried about that. We published a series of articles in the British Medical Journal just 2 weeks ago. And there was an editorial that accompanied these articles, saying, oh yeah, for these tools to become good tools in the consultation, we will need regulation. And like, well, that's a problem because of course we need regulation. That is certainly not me who's going to challenge that. But the regulation first attitude has the risk of encouraging an attitude of passivity on the part of, for instance, professionals who actually have more influence than they think they have. And this group of professionals could actually collectively leverage their negotiating power and demand certain features. If they just wait for regulation to intervene, there's a risk that regulation will arrive only when design choices are frozen, when it's too late to influence the design of the systems. And so I'm basically very keen to convey the sense that we all have agency in this, that that we can't afford to be passive and hope for some magic intervention from regulators. Yes, of course, regulators will need to intervene. That's a given to me. But I don't think we can afford to wait passively in the meantime, basically.
Mm. Yeah, well, I would echo that call to arms and just reiterate that the paper, which is called Beyond Quantification, Navigating Uncertainty in Professional AI Systems, is online now. You can find it at RSS, Data Science and Artificial Intelligence, and I'll link it in the description as well. So do read the paper. There's also a call for submissions out for the journal. So please respond and share your thoughts and join this conversation. And thank you so much, Sylvie. That's been absolutely fascinating. So grateful for your time. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Annie.